Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. My program is titled World Watchers. It emanates from Pacific Grove, California, broadcast number 692, March the 11th, 1985. There is something nurturing in the background of all the things that I have studied or other people have studied and put together that is very disconcerting to me, but makes sense in terms of what is happening now with the power structure and why they are behaving as they are, because otherwise all of these various news things that I'm reading every single day and the exposés couldn't be possible if people really had their sanity, the people in charge of things at various levels of the government or as private individuals. But they seem to have negated their responsibility for what is coming down. And the only thing that I can figure out is that deep inside of the majority of people who could be in a position to speak up, this evil force has tapped that part of them that makes sense to them, and people are behaving accordingly in a selfish, self-centered way that has been described in a publication. It's privately published, but it's been sent to me several times, called the Black Fascist Power Report. Now, before the massacres at Jonestown, I had talked about those events on my program, weekly program, because I'm always studying political assassinations, and Jim Jones, with links to the intelligence community, was having members of Jonestown obediently sign confessions to murdering of public officials that had not yet taken place. And after studying the famous Oswald diary and Sirhan's diary and James Earl Ray's diary, these famous alleged loners that keep well-documented records to show their leftist leanings or their craziness, where they have contacts with high-up people in government or in fascist groups, I was interested in what was happening in Jonestown. And when the Turner Diaries were mentioned by William Pierce in 1980, I read about them because it was apropos of some shootouts and the Posse Comitatus, and I put that on the air. And 5 years went by before the standard press, the newspaper articles of the columnists would recognize the Turner Diary as being, in fact, a blueprint to kill all blacks and Jews in the United States and to even overthrow the government. Now, studying World War II, the fascism of Hitler and Mussolini, there have been thousands and thousands of books, you can't say how many, trying to define fascism or the appeal that Hitler had or the way he could take all of the countries that he did without much opposition, and then after the war sweep them all up as his allies and bedfellows. It has to be more than just disliking the Soviet Union that people go to such lengths, because in studying Hitler's Germany, for the most part, they appeared like very good people that just did bad things. And when the war was over, that was the line we were supposed to remember. It happened now, but it's over, and we want to rebuild and join Germany with a democracy, whereas we're putting in the dictatorships all over the world. And it has to be more than saving the Vatican Empire and being the soldiers of Rome. The way that the people in control have been operating makes me believe that the explanation of what the black fascist power is taps deeper into people, because when I read their definition of it, and I'll just share a few lines with you now, I want to go on to some other material, it describes Ronald Reagan, it describes Henry Kissinger and Vernon Walters, or Jeane Kirkpatrick, or J. Peter Grace, or Claire Sterling, or William Buckley, or James Buckley, or George Bush, and the characters that line our history books of this whole era, whether it's Richard Helms, as I say, Vernon Walters, the new UN ambassador, or William Casey. The power to do evil is so great after the war, when the war was winding down, and I guess watching Hitler, but just it tapped the resources of people to know how much fun evil is, how many millions you can make, how many people you can hurt. And it became something beyond territory or boundaries. What I'm afraid of is that it doesn't have to be anything about wealth anymore, communism or anti-communism. It just has to be the unleashed power of doing it, which is killing or hurting, just as the soldiers of fortune or the gun-ho may have been funded by agencies linked to Taiwan, Japan, to Chiang Kai-shek, to our police departments. How could this infestation get so much protection unless there was a common bond of suppression among the people who really jump at the opportunity to be as mean as they can be, and that's what black fascist power is. Nobody of any intelligence no group is opposing these people, no university presidents, even Dr. Spock, who I quoted a week ago or several weeks ago, talks against atomic bombs. Nobody is figuring out who is running our lives and making the decisions to do such terrible things, and we are going into debt, tremendous amount of money, just to keep it up. The idea that it has to be kept up. Money, debts, pollution, billions of dollars to clean up what we've polluted already aren't significant. The fun of doing the kill and the chase seems to be the important thing. Now, this letter I got, the Black Power Fascist Group are from Minneapolis, and they just sent me a few statements. Well, it's about 30 pages. I'm going to share about 3 sentences or paragraphs with you. And they just describe black fascism as an appetite for absolute power. It overturns the social contract. It downgrades equality, justice, and freedom, and instead it hammers out a single thing, the amoral will of the ruling elite, that might makes right. If we're strong, we're okay, that the weak are contemptible, and that the greed needs no excuse. Absolutely no excuse. So while you read that the amount of millionaires doubled in the last few years while Reagan was president, the amount of fascism and repression and problems going on around the world has also doubled. They quote a sentence or paragraph from Friedrich Nietzsche that reminds me of Henry Kissinger or Reagan, of the people I mentioned. And it says what they do, the very meaning of it is their justification, doing what they want for themselves, not the community, but just in the act of doing it. For this reason, it must be ready to sacrifice without batting an eyelash a mass of people who must be, in their interest, humiliated and reduced to the state of mutilated beings, of slaves and of instruments. Its fundamental belief, in fact, must be that society does not exist for itself, but is the substructure and the frame which permits an elite to elevate itself to a superior state by virtue of a higher mission or simply in its own interest. It doesn't even have to have that higher mission. Now, interesting enough, they list a whole section of their beliefs, but the one that caught my eye was belief number 5, that the victim is always wrong. And this is what the Black Fascist Power Report says. Invariably, at some level, the victim should have known what was coming. Suffering is traceable to ignorance, and ignorance inevitably, necessarily, and desirably leads to punishment. They're telling you right now, and I personally don't think I am ignorant, and I think I understand what's coming and am trying to share it with you and pass it on, but they have total contempt for people who can't even figure out what's coming, because they even know in their own pamphlet that if you could figure it out, you could stop them. But as long as you work on terminology of, as I say, boundaries or wealth or define communism, or say we have to have death squads because Lenin or Stalin killed X amount of people, therefore we do it. We have to have biological warfare because they do it. We have to be offensive and deploy Soviet missiles against the Soviets because they do it. We are using all kinds of words, and if you can't figure out that they're leading us to World War III and that they will be totally unmerciful to the native population at home, either before the war happens or after, then you're missing a certain point, just as I tried to warn earlier about the Turner Diary or what was going to come down in Jonestown. I had a wonderful meeting up in De Anza College with people who listen to World Watchers and David Emery and Nip Tuck up in that area, Cupertino, San Jose area. And I promised them I would give sources for a few things that I mentioned there, and I do want to get them on the air and share them with you also. One thing that I referred to was an article in the San Jose Mercury. Edwin Meese lobbies for Reagan's economic plan. San Francisco, March the 2nd, 1985. Edwin Meese devoted his maiden speech as a U.S. Attorney General not to talk about law and order, but a plea for public support of President Reagan's economic program. He was speaking before a conference sponsored by the San Francisco-based Institute for Contemporary Studies, and that was set up for Edwin Meese in the first place by the Mellon Foundation, and this was one of the think tanks where he can cross back and forth across the country and give out his propaganda, and various people can do the same thing. It's Institute for Contemporary Studies. And it concludes what he was saying as the Attorney General, asking us to help with the funds when the man he's working with and has for a long time ran on the platform that he would balance the budget and then spent more than all the other presidents combined. Meese called for a constitutional amendment to require a balanced federal budget. Now, be warned, once Meese and Reagan and the Heritage Foundation want a constitutional convention, they will put in a clause and make a foreign-born be able to run for president, and that will be Henry Kissinger. He's been waiting for that, and I mentioned before that when he comes out to California for his annual Bohemian Grove 2 years ago, when he came, they played Hail to the Chief. And these were the leaders of our country, and they meant it. So that the only thing between him and Hail to the Chief is the constitutional change, and I believe that the money can be spent like drunken sailors out on a binge, and that will create the excuse for the convention. And then Fritz Kramer, whoever he represents, whether it is Martin Bormann and the entire Nazi network of multinational corporations that all link together, they will be in when his puppet, Henry Kissinger, is president. And then, of course, people like Alexander Haig, another protege, becomes Secretary of State again, or the head of the National Security Council. Now, the other article about the Constitutional Convention, bringing it up again, that I know is the same week, for Reverend Moon's paper that works very closely with the White House, January the 24th, constitutional amendment on the budget gathers force. And all of a sudden, they're bringing up this desire to have a change in the Constitution, and at that point, with the massive programming that they are doing all along these past few years, they will push Henry Kissinger as President of the United States, and because the Heritage Foundation is now saying, let's listen to him, he's great, and they're pushing Henry Kissinger. They pretended that they were arm's distance before because he was a left with the Rockefellers. It was all a crock of BS. And now this is something to watch, and we should alert our various congressmen. How would you vote if this were thus and so? And then get out some of the old tapes I did, or future ones or present ones, on Henry Kissinger. Now, Jack Anderson had one just yesterday that was a very revealing story about Henry Kissinger. Some of you don't get the Saturday or Sunday sections of Jack Anderson, but we do here on the Monterey Peninsula. This is titled New Spirit in India, March the 10th, 1985. It is reported that the position of former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who recently paid a low-profile visit to New Delhi, has a message, bearing a message for Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi from President Reagan. According to diplomatic sources, Kissinger came away both impressed and enthused by Gandhi's new leadership. Kissinger reportedly gave Gandhi assurances of close U.S. support and cooperation, provided only that India refrain from anything that might seriously embarrass the United States on the eyes of the world. Now, the only thing that would embarrass the United States would be the truth that they had Mrs. Gandhi murdered so that they could deal with the son, and the son got the message. Now, we have ambassadors to India, and we don't need Henry Kissinger over there assuring them that if you don't embarrass the United States, then in the eyes of the world, then you and I, buddy, will get along good. It's like a mafia boss giving the orders, to the new kid around. Jack Anderson said New Delhi's realization of Kissinger's Metternichian handiwork, that's his favorite, Metternich, caused relations between India and the United States to sink to an all-time low when Kissinger was in charge. This visit was Henry's mea culpa, one diplomat told my associate. After years of mutual suspicion, a measure of cordiality was restored following the 1982 visit to Washington of Mrs. Gandhi, and now her son will come to Washington. He's scheduled to visit here in June, and we'll tip the balance of power and say don't have anything to do with the Soviet, and don't embarrass us in the eyes of the world, and we will treat you nicely. Remember what happened to your mom, and don't tell anybody about it. That's all that it can mean. That's what Jack Anderson wrote, and you can't take that article or the paragraph any other way. There's no other way to interpret it, because he has no way to embarrass us so much as that it's recently firing all his top aides, linking the connections to London, to the Kissinger associates, the people that Kissinger and Haig and Eagleburg travel with, and even Jesse Helms and the travels in this country of the various Sikhs. So he's giving his terms. That is Henry Kissinger. Forget the ambassadors, just do the murders and send him around to do the cleaning up. Just to get the good essence of Kissinger, I've had an article in my files for a long time, and I don't believe I've shared this with you. This is one from the New Zealand press that Ted Rubenstein got. He goes to the library and gets these marvelous articles, and this came out in 1983 when people were being sentenced for the killing of Aldo Moro, the Prime Minister of Italy, and this article came out, and it's titled Tough Talking, and a press conference was held on November the 18th. This is 1982. The article was written in January, asking George Shultz a question about Dr. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, who gratuitously gave Shultz a certificate of good character in his memoirs. Mr. Secretary, at your last press conference, you referred to your very high regard for Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, and I'm wondering if this has all been changed. This is after the trial of Moro. Shultz, I haven't changed my mind. Well, this is the other comment. Well, there have been some revelations coming out in the Italian courts that have reported over the Italian press, quoting Aldo Moro's closest friend, Mr. Guerzani. Moro, a former Italian prime minister, was abducted and killed by members of the Red Brigade. Now they're on trial for murder, but what is most intriguing about the press conference is that not a word about the evidence that Mr. Guerzani cited in the Italian courts and published in the Italian press was carried by the international news agencies who normally transmit the merest tit-tattle about personalities of a global reputation. Nor has there any notice been taken outside of Italy, which has its bureaus in Rome, the newspapers in Rome. The Corriere della Sera, reporting the trial in its issue November the 11th, said 5 witnesses referred to the encounter between Henry Kissinger and Moro in 1974 in Washington. None could provide specific details, but the paper said that day that Corrado Guerzani, one of the closest aides of Aldo Moro, declared it was a bitter conversation between Kissinger and Moro. I don't believe in dogmas. I'm not a Catholic, and I don't have confidence in your political approach, which is highly negative, Kissinger told him, pointing at the former premier. Their disagreement was very strong and full of resentment. In the following days, in St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, Moro felt totally sick, Guerzani told the court in Italy. Guerzani maintained that Moro was widely regarded in the office of the U.S. Secretary of the State as incorrigible, pro-communist. They feared him. They thought he would condone and corrupt Italy, although he himself did not take part in it to weaken his party. Moro was president of the Christian Democratic Party. Guerzani told the Red Brigade trial Moro was upset, and at the end of his visit to the United States, he accused Henry Kissinger of being absolutely incapable of understanding the real political situation in Italy. By that time, Moro was strongly considering whether to withdraw from politics for life or at least 2 years, and at that time he refused to be nominated as prime minister because of threats that his family knew about to his life. Guerzani told the court that in 1978 Moro decided to make a clean break with his relationships with Henry Kissinger. He wrote an angry article against Kissinger, according to Guerzani, who advised Moro don't publish it. It would only worsen the situation. Gersani placed this article in the archives and gave a copy to Mrs. Aldo Murrow after the death of her husband. It remains a mystery to this day. Gersani told the court that he spoke to Murrow on the telephone of the evening of March the 15th, 1978, a few hours before Murrow was kidnapped. Murrow feared his name would be linked to the Lockheed affair, and he would be identified as Antelope Cobbler, the mysterious middleman in the bribery scandal. Murrow told Gersano, according to the evidence, that it was one of Henry Kissinger's men who accused him of being the Antelope Cobbler. Gersani said at the time of his kidnapping on March the 16th, Murrow was carrying documents relating to the Lockheed affair. So the Lockheed scandal was the Central Intelligence Agency funding money through various agents and countries, particularly in Italy, and there were members of the Japanese government that got caught in the scandal, and also Prince Bernhard, and a lot of heads of states were touched, but we keep paying these heads of states to stay into power no matter what the cost. And if Mr. Aldo Murrow had evidence to prove Henry Kissinger a liar, that he wasn't that particular person, he wasn't going to live to talk about it, and he was immediately kidnapped, and the papers about Lockheed were taken from him, and I suppose were never recovered to this day. Because if the Red Brigade were really leftists, and think about this one, a scroungy bunch of radical leftists, they would have used the Lockheed papers in the satchel of Aldo Murrow and then exposed the corrupt Italian government for what it was, being paid off by America. But the Red Brigade was part of the CIA, just as our SLA was. It was a right-wing group, and therefore they disposed of the Lockheed papers and then killed Aldo Murrow. There's quite a bit on the Korean airline in the newspapers these days because of the multi-million-dollar suit against the United States government. And, of course, I watch it very closely because I wrote an article on the Korean airline, and I like to see some more pieces of the puzzle come in that I had figured out as early as a couple of years ago. This one article is from the San Francisco Chronicle. Air Force destroyed data on Korean jet. And I got another one from the Chicago Tribune about the jet material being destroyed by our United States government. The Air Force destroyed the tape showing at least part of the radar track of Korean airline flight 007, which was shot down by the Soviet Union. How the Air Force came to destroy the tape soon after the disaster has become an issue in a lawsuit brought against the United States government. And according to testimony given in the U.S. District Court last week, the Air Force Regional Operations Command Center had tracked the flight by radar after it took off from Alaska, at least part of the flight. They're admitting part of the flight. The Air Force, which customarily impounds any information relating to aviation disaster, did not save the radar tape. Remember, this all sounds familiar. After you study the John Kennedy assassination, then all these other assassinations follow, and the same pattern, modus operandi, takes place. When John Kennedy was killed, the autopsy papers were destroyed. John Connolly's clothing was sent to the dry cleaner. The car was sent to Dearborn, Michigan within 48 hours. There are 27 pieces of information, hard evidence that was destroyed. But now we're back to the controversial Korean airline. I just want to say that my training for knowing how these things happen came by studying the Kennedy assassination. Jan K. Von Flattern, a Justice Department trial attorney, told the court that the radar data being referred to as just Air Force data, defense data, which is recycled every 15 days. He's implying it's just our Air Force. It has nothing to do with a member of Congress and a dual role as chairman of the John Birch Society. The tape on which it is kept is recycled every 15 days, and after some specific effort to preserve, Mr. McDonald-Madole, an attorney for the family members who filed the suit, and everyone else was told that such preservation had not taken place within 15 days of the accident. They had no idea why. Von Flattern added that officials at the center have said they did not see anything unusual in their scopes when the airliner was shot down and were not responsible for keeping track of such outbound civilian aircraft. Attorneys for the family insist that the full story of the tapes destruction has not been told, and they want to talk more to the Air Force officials. In the court hearing, when von Flatten was talking, he said the Air Force keeps their tapes 30 hours, not 15 days, as he had said earlier. He changed his mind, and it became reduced to 30 hours and not 15 days. And he said, in any event, we do not have them. We have not had them since shortly after the accident. Now, the Washington Post had a story February 24th, 1985, with regard to this lawsuit. The Federal Aviation Administration established a communication procedure in 1978 to notify the Soviet Union if an aircraft flying the North Pacific was hijacked and considered likely to enter Soviet airspace. So our excuse to not contact them was that we didn't have communication back and forth. We've had it since 1978, and they could have been notified. This particular lawsuit is being brought out, the Washington Post says, in the U.S. District Court here on behalf of the relatives and passengers who were killed. The FAA document shows, according to the motion of the attorney, Donald Madole, that specific arrangements for communication with the Soviet Union exist in anticipation of unusual aviation incidents. The document orders FAA controllers in Anchorage to notify controllers in Tokyo if there is any indication that the hijacked aircraft will enter USSR space. While there is no question that the Soviets shot down the airliner after it strayed into the Soviet airspace, there's been considerable debate about whether the United States military or intelligence sources were aware that the airliner was off course, and they should have notified and warned the crew through the FAA. Now, this is a story in the Washington Post that there were means to communicate with the Soviet Union to stop this incident from happening. So why did we let it happen? The why I answered in my article in February 83 in Hustler. Actually, I wrote in 83. It was February 84 that it was published. Now, there was an article in Der Spiegel that I might have shared with you, but apropos of this new material, I want to detail it for you for new listeners, or in case I didn't have time to do it at length. This is a new study that was published in the German magazine Der Spiegel by Anthony Sampson, a well-known writer, investigative journalist who has to be taken seriously because he has studied the intelligence community. He's the author of the book The Arms Bazaar, The Seven Sisters, and he covers a lot of credibility when he writes. This is the story. For the first time since the Korean airline flight was shot down, top officials of the Reagan administration now have become directly implicated in the incident. The German magazine Der Spiegel, by British journalist Anthony Sampson, said that the United States State Department, the CIA, the National Security Council, and the White House itself were fully informed of events as they unfolded and were deeply involved in the orchestration of everything from the false stories to the cover-up. The incident plummeted U.S.-Soviet relations to an all-time low, destroyed the arms control talks, led to the deployment of U.S. cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe. The Reagan administration claimed from the beginning it had no idea the plane was more than 350 miles off course, in spite of the fact that there were numerous U.S. surveillance aircraft, satellite, surface craft, land-based radar all looking in the area through which 007 passed. It is further maintained the United States intelligence agencies didn't know the plane was shot down until several hours after the tragedy, according to the New York Times, a statement made by Secretary of State for Canadian European Affairs Richard Burt, another co-worker and cohort of Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, and Haig and Eagleburger. Der Spiegel's evidence indicates, however, that the United States, and Burt in particular, knew about the incident within 2.5 hours after the downing, and Anthony Sampson charged that the administration leaked false stories that the plane was safe on the Sakhalin Island to give the White House time to prepare a propaganda blitz. The article, reviewed by writers David Hollander and Stephen Saint, was reprinted in the LA Weekly October 26, in case you don't have it, and they said the charges that the United States knew within minutes when the plane was shot down and the information was relayed to Japan and then to Fort Meade, outside of Washington, D.C. We'll take a 1-minute break and just go back on this and the deception of the Reagan government, because in 1983, October 3rd, 1983, in my broadcast, I referred to the fact and went into the information that Catherine McDonald knew that what was going on. She was in touch with the State Department and the CIA and having a telephone conversation, she and through her brother-in-law, Harold McDonald, after the plane actually was down, they were working out some kind of a script. We'll take a break one now and then come back. This is Mae Brussell. This is side 2 of broadcast number 692. The program is titled World Watchers. It's March the 11th, 1985, and I'm going particularly slowly on the details of these articles because I did so much work previously on the Korean airline, and as I said before, with the lawsuit coming up, we're going to get more views on this particular event. I just want to make a few more comments on the investigative work of Anthony Sampson, well-known London investigator and author, talking about our President of the United States. This is coming from Der Spiegel in Germany and from London, and he's describing what happened when the Korean airline went down. He said what followed was a high-level telephone conversation by virtually every important administration head. Then National Security Advisor William Clark, Presidential Assistant Edwin Meese, CIA Director William Casey, Secretary of State George Shultz, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Lawrence Eagleburger, as well as Burt. Now, Lawrence Eagleburger is the chairman of Kissinger Associates, that floating public relations firm that takes the expert Kissinger all around the world with various clients and monarchies and multinational corporations. He's just the floating Defense Department, the ambassador at large for the repressive dope dealers and murderers that are described as black, I call them the black fascist power people. This is the way they behave and use power. And Mr. Eagleburger was the Kissinger-Kramer representative right there, right in the White House, carrying on before he left that position then to work for Kissinger Associates. According to Der Spiegel, the meeting made a decision to use the incident as a way to crush the European peace movement by showing how bad the Soviets were. Now, they couldn't orchestrate this in 2 or 3 hours. This had to be well planned, and I knew it was by the editorials that came down, how well they were written by the next morning's press. They were to crush the peace movement by proving how bad, of course, the Soviets were, as Burt reportedly remarked during the conference. It was also decided to float the false story that they landed safe at Sakhalin Island. The reason for that, the letter, was not only to buy time, but to make it appear as if the U.S. was unaware of their flight. The phony story and the lost hour have been long interested those who followed the tale of the Korean airline. The airliner was shot down at 3:38 a.m. The event was not only picked up by the Japanese at Miswa, but by a host of United States intelligence listening devices in the area. And this article goes on to say that the CIA had information and they had meetings, and along with Tokyo and our Central Intelligence Agency and with Seoul, South Korea, they decided to leak the story that the plane had landed safely. Well, Jesse Helms had arrived at Seoul, South Korea, and of course the Korean CIA is our CIA. So in collusion, the whole story from the Japanese point of view, or the Korean and the American CIA, was to stall for time and act as if they didn't know anything going on. This article in Der Spiegel says there are also indications that the fate of the 007 was well known at the highest levels of the Japanese government, according to one highly placed source in the Nakasone administration. When the Korean Foreign Ministry released the story about the plane being safe, Japan's chief cabinet secretary laughed at the report and said, "Someone is trying to control the news." The fake story kept the ball rolling, giving the United States time to check the Japanese tapes with their own, and now you see our tapes are destroyed. As soon as this comes out, this story came out November 24th, 1984, just at the end of the last year, 3 months ago. So when the trial begins, no tapes, sorry, We don't have any tapes. And according to Anthony Sampson, that kept the story going while they figured out, I guess, what to do. The Der Spiegel article will be a hard one for the administration to answer because Sampson is an extremely well-known journalist. And then it goes on to say, much of the material in Der Spiegel article, as well in the LA Weekly, is said to be from sources uncovered by the two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Seymour Hersh, who also knows about Henry Kissinger. And that naturally, this article doesn't mention Henry Kissinger. I just put that in. I asked Seymour Hersh, and I might have mentioned it to you, about the possibility that that airplane was down to make a martyr of Larry McDonald and for a lot of other reasons, such as stopping his testifying regarding Western Goals. He was chairman of the Western Goals, with their computer into the Los Angeles Police Department and other police departments around the country. And Seymour Hersh was outraged. Oh, of course they couldn't do anything like that. Just as they wouldn't blow up Dorothy Hunt on the plane to keep the stories of Watergate from being told or from the president being blackmailed. One of the interesting things about that manual, that CIA manual that was written for controlling countries or taking them over or keeping the native population under your thumb, has sections that pertain to events that are happening to us, because I consider us a conquered country since World War II, and that the intelligence community treats us that way. And one point they have in their directions, and these directions were written at the time of the Vietnam War and the South Korean War. They've admitted to the Vietnam, so I'm sure the same people had it going back much earlier when they tried out their muscle after Nazi Germany with the Korean and then the Vietnam War. I imagine it was written by Edward Lansdale, or people have suggested in various articles it was on counterinsurgency. But in one paragraph, it tells how to hold established citizens. It's titled, Established Citizens, Subjective Internal Control. Established citizens such as doctors, lawyers, businessmen, landholders, minor state officials will be recruited to the movement and used for subjective internal control of groups and associations to which they belong or may belong. And this is true not only of landholders or doctors or lawyers, but we have journalists. I think there were 400 at the time of Watergate that worked for the intelligence community in some capacity. So they control what various writers say. In other words, they can tell you part of the story. Just say Mark Lane can tell about the grassy knoll regarding the Kennedy assassination, but they can't go beyond. And certain people can write and get books published, major publishers, on little pieces of the puzzle, but they know when to stop, that you don't go any further. And if it's going to come out anyway, they'll acknowledge it that far. So I think that Seymour Hersh is the kind of person that will put a control on anybody who comes up with such an outrageous idea when it actually is the only explanation for what happened and why he traveled alone and all the other members of his party, Larry McDonald's party of 36, all went on another airplane. Now, off to another subject which also touches on Henry Kissinger. Every news event does, and I think I'll just have to remind ourselves of that as we bring up these various items because of the plans to get that constitutional convention going. This is one I had 3 years ago in my files, and see how it pertains to what's going on the borders of Cambodia and Vietnam today. NBC had a full 5 days segment on the refugees in Vietnam and the placement of where the former policemen or officers are kept until they are psychologically restructured. And there's fear that if they're allowed to come to the United States, they want to start the war over again. So this story is very pertinent to what I saw on NBC. And Robert Keith Gray is the public relations man for NBC Broadcasting. And this Mr. Alfred had gone over and done these very pathetic segments of these particular families who are broken up. And there is a new bill being put before Congress now to open up all immigration to anti-communists. If you're an anti-communist, you can come into this country. And that's why this particular article is pertinent for right now. Exiled force waiting to return to homeland. This is Premier Key says the Vietnamese are training in the United States to liberate his homeland. And this is in Tokyo in 1982. He had a press conference. Since that time, he's been identified by Judge Kaufman's committee as being part of the large organized crime syndicate in Orange County, but it is the mafia drug money that keeps the weapons going so nicely, greasing the guns. But anyway, this isn't Tokyo. Exiled South Vietnamese Vice President Nguyen Khai Ky, that's the fellow who loved Adolf Hitler so much he had pictures of him around, said Wednesday he and other former fighting men are training in the United States in preparation for their armed struggle against the communists and their regime in their homeland. Ky appealed to the United States and other Western nations to back a coalition of anti-communists from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos to help liberate ourselves from the Vietnamese communists. The flamboyant ex-fighter pilot, who's living in Orange County for the last 7 years, said that the overseas Vietnamese community financed military training in the United States. They are training camps and programs for Vietnamese in the United States today, and we do it ourselves. He made these remarks at a luncheon speech for 200 members of the Foreign Correspondents Club in Japan, and he indicated that he and other former South Vietnamese military men are conducting their training on public property in the United States. See, once Ronald Reagan took the oath of office in January of 81, then these guys could go around traveling and be arming and be assured that if they're anti-communist, William Casey and Vernon Walters and the whole gang will make sure that they go back and start the whole thing over again. He said he uses public property, the so-called national parks in America, he said. They're the best places for military training. He predicted a military role for the Vietnamese anti-communists would develop soon, prompted by resistance efforts in Cambodia. Former head of state Prince Sihanouk had formed a coalition of his own followers, the Khmer Rouge forces of ousted leader Pol Pot. And it goes on to say that Ronald Reagan, it refers to Ronald Reagan being the president now, and I assure you that they will listen to our cause with very friendly reception. Well, you know John Singlaub of the World Anti-Communist League and Reverend Moon and Chiang Kai-shek's family, so strong over in Taiwan, they're all listening and helping him. He said, we accept former Liberation Front communists to fight with us, that we would accept them, Key said. Additional recruits would come from Vietnamese refugees throughout the world, and 100,000 or so still in the refugee camps in Thailand. Key, 52, runs a liquor store in Norwalk, said he's becoming increasingly active in efforts to return to Vietnam, and he's been in regular contact with resistance groups inside that country and in the United States for the last 14 months, and he used the occasion of speaking to a large group of journalists to tell them that he's training in the United States and setting up these various activities, and that's why you see so much of it in the news. In case you wondered where it was coming from, there was an article recently about Ronald Reagan's stepping up covert action all over the world. Well, Premier Key is directing it from the national parks in California. Now, Congressman Edwards wrote a very important editorial for the San Jose Mercury, and it wasn't a syndicated story on the wire services, and I don't know how many of you saw it. He formerly was in the FBI. He's a member of Congress in California. Congress must reckon and take control over the war-making policies. You may have seen something similar to this in some of your newspapers. This is what Don Edwards said. Speaking before the National Press Club in December, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger listed 6 criteria that should be present before the United States troops are committed to combat. Shockingly, nowhere in Weinberger's laundry list was a requirement of congressional approval, the condition considered most essential by our founding fathers and emphatically imposed in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. Congress was mentioned Weinberger's 5th requirement in passing. He said, there must be some reasonable assurance that we will have the support of the people and their elected officials in Congress. Some reasonable assurance, a show of hand. Caspar Weinberger, a member of the Black Fascist Power Group, that he wants to declare this kind of activity, and they have completely bypassed, he and Kissinger, the Constitution, the entire War Department has something holier that only can be explained, not as that religious prophecy, the Armageddon necessarily, and I want to get into that with Reagan, but the Black Fascist power, the desire for vengeance to kill, and Reagan has an absolute necessity for the Star Wars, even ill-advised and expensive, and the threat it'll bring, the Star Wars operation, and he's going to overthrow Nicaragua no matter what the Congress says. He has to do it. It's a compulsion that is based not on a religious belief that can be reasoned out or felt, but more having to do with black fascist power and the descriptions that Nietzsche has of what the kind of person is like who has that kind of power. Now, Congressman Edwards is worried about this, and the fact that the Constitution, he says, is explicit. And the history of the Constitutional Convention and the Federalist Papers makes it clear that Congress alone is authorized to decide when and if we go to war. The earliest U.S. Supreme Court recognized Congress as a sole war-making machine, and he goes into the history where time and time again during this century, and since just this time, American presidents have sent U.S. troops into foreign hostilities without prior authorization from Congress. Our forces have been sent into the armed conflicts around the globe: Central America, the Middle East, the Caribbean, the Far East, the most notably the Southeast Asia, all in the name of national interest and all at the individual initiative of the president, and all with ex post facto approval of the government body holding the exclusive power to make such commitments. Who was behind all of that in Washington besides pulling those strings, besides Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger, who managed the Central America, now manages it, the Middle East, the Caribbean, the Far East, Southeast Asia, having his hand in every single pie, just like he runs off to India and tells Rajiv Gandhi, don't embarrass us and we'll allow you to exist. Congressman Edwards says in each of these instances of presidential war-making, the nation would have benefited by husky debate that prior to congressional approval would have provided. We needed it. In none of these instances would the security of the country have ever been imperiled by that delay required for congressional and public consideration. Today, because Congress has relinquished the war-making power by timid responses and by the enactment of empty war powers resolution in 1973, Reagan is free to wage war at will. He can bomb or shell friendly nations such as Lebanon. He can invade with foreign mercenaries or mine neutral seas. He can even invade and conquer an independent nation, as in Grenada. And I referred to that identical to Hitler's Blitzkrieg, and that's what it was. It was simply a takeover, the black fascist power wanting to have it because I want it. Not that I'll deal with Mr. Bishop, not that Mr. Eric Gary is corrupt, the mafia and prostitution and organized crime and what's going on there is bad in some ways. No. We want it, we'll take it. Now, Congressman Edwards says an American president is now an absolute monarch on all issues of war and peace, due to Congress surrendering the war-making decision. In more than 22 years that I have been a member of Congress, I can't find a single example of where the American people would not have been better off if its presidents had respected the war-making requirements. Now, John Kennedy will have been dead 22 years. It's the 21st year now, and after he was killed, and many researchers, along with me, call that the coup that changed this country. And Congressman Edwards in Washington sees the difference and how they don't want to use this Constitution that was written to protect us. Well, if you have Reinhard Gehlen come in from Hitler's intelligence to run your intelligence community, and 3,000 or 4,000 other Nazis, and Fritz Kramer with his monocle comes in and is an advisor to the Pentagon, and Henry Kissinger making the major policies in the National Security Council and in the State Department, what do you expect? None of them American-born. Mr. Brzezinski either. What's the Constitution to these people? What does it mean to them? So Congressman Edwards is saying that they're trying to get House Resolution 1304 through Washington now. The existing War Powers Resolution has that fatal flaw that the president alone decides when to go to war. The congressional approval is required only after forces were committed. This provision emasculates Article 1, Section 8, that our troops already are in combat. House Resolution that's coming up, 1304, eliminates this loophole while providing for emergencies. The president can't start a war without consulting Congress and getting approval of a majority vote, and it ensures deep involvement of the American people, of who you send to Congress. This is an emergency situation he's referring to, House Resolution 1304, and you might write to your congressman, and you might even say that Henry Kissinger would be president, or could be, and something terrible would happen. Now, I want to get to a matter that I briefly mentioned at De Anza. The reference for this, it has to do with the Star Wars conference, and Daniel Graham, the former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the partner and in the offices of Fritz Kramer, the mentor of Henry Kissinger, walked out on a meeting that was reported in the Houston Post, I didn't see it in any other paper, regarding the Star Wars intention for a first strike, because he was exposed and had to leave the meeting pretending, well, he was good and angry, but he left the meeting, and this is so important with the dialogue of the Star Wars going on now, supposedly to protect us from the Soviet Union, the confrontation between Daniel Graham and various people who were selected to watch the buildup of the Star Wars and have checks and balances on it. Interestingly enough, reported by Roland Evans and Robert Novak in the Houston Post, titled OTA Report, that's the Office of Technology Assessment, could spell big trouble for Star Wars. Well, so far, everything that Reagan has wanted, Reagan has gotten. He, as I say, he's the black fascist power, and he can really get anything he wants because he represents evidently what all those other weaklings, all the people who submit to what he says, give him that power. That's how he has it. He wants the Star Wars, and even though the Houston Post says there could be trouble, there probably won't be, but this is why they bring it up. They said the political battle over President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, known as Star Wars, took a bitter turn. They say this is in the Houston Post in February 28th, just a few weeks ago. It took a bitter turn when one member of the highly placed advisory panel, the Strategic Defense Initiative, the SDI panel, quietly resigned on grounds that Congress and their Office of Technology Assessment was preparing a report that would try to kill, it was designed to kill the Star Wars proposals. That charge by retired Lieutenant General Daniel Graham, an all-out supporter, he's the one who designed the Star Wars operations, blew the cover off of an intense but unpublicized struggle between the Star Wars backers and the anti-Reaganite Office of Technology Assessment. Now, if you don't think a thing is practical just on the merits of it not being good, then you are an anti-Reaganite and your motives are questioned. Congressional appropriations hold the key to the president's call for a full-scale research effort to explore their defenses against Soviet nuclear missile attack. The study of the Office of Technology Assessment, an arm of Congress that sometimes operates with little visible congressional reign, could go a long way towards setting back the Star Wars proposal on Capitol Hill and set a mood against Reagan's policy. Graham's charge of the Office of Technology Assessment, he says it was prejudiced in drafting its report, due for publication in the spring, was responded to by Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Lugar got into this, and he's not on the 21-member advisory panel of the Office of Technology Assessment, but he read the report that's coming out, and when Lugar read one portion of the draft of Chapter 3 of the Office of Technology Assessment, there was studies suggesting that Reagan's aim may be a reckless U.S. first strike against the Soviet Union. Senator Lugar was stunned. Now, Senator Lugar and Representative Senator D'Amato from New York, I always call them the two senators from the Vatican, very conservative, do everything Reagan wants. They're not anti-Reagan. Just follow what Lugar does, forget the other one. So when Lugar was absolutely stunned, the way this report was written, you can imagine what was in that report. Graham's resignation from the advisory panel pointed to oversee, but not to write, the Office of Technology Assessment report. It apparently, when it came out this month, he wanted to oversee it. One reason he gave for the report, the project director John H. Gibbons, for getting on the panel in his letter of recognition, was the same draft language that offended Lugar. Graham said the language apparently appeared to be concocted in a way to create an a priori case against Star Wars. The language that so surprised Lugar states that a suggested goal for strategic defense is to provide a sufficiently capable defense that the United States can credibly threaten the use of offensive nuclear weapons should it choose. In other words, the draft language written by the staffers hinted that Reagan wants to perfect a nuclear defense and use it to blackmail the Soviet Union and into doing his bidding and accept an American nuclear attack against Moscow, which Moscow could not retaliate if they had this technology going. Lugar told us Reagan is perfectly justified in researching the potential of this strategy, but he was shocked at the draft language that was contained in it. The report that's been drafted up, this early report, contains language and other logic which seems bizarre, according to this story in the Houston Post. Assuming the United States perfected a capable defense of military targets, it says the Soviets would attack in an effort to inflict massive destruction on 75% of our population. The advisory panel includes several experts with strong pro-Star Wars views that wrote up this report, such as retired Air Force Major General John Toomey and its chairman, Dr. Guvford Stever, S-T-V-E-R. But also on the panel are anti-Star War officials, high officials whose reputations were made decades ago in establishing the strategy of mutual assured destruction. This is described by Jimmy Carter as two scorpions in a bottle, or Ronald Reagan as two scorpions in a bottle. Jimmy Carter, last year authorized the Office of Technology Assessment to write a background paper that infuriated this administration because it derided the Star Wars as the offensive weapon. That underlines General Graham's rationale for resigning from the advisory panel. For Reagan, the resignation is a setback in itself by virtue of Graham's expertise and strong support of the Star Wars. He quickly got off this group when they revealed the role of his little baby that could be used as an offensive first strike, and that is evidently written up in the report. I won't have time to go into this long article on the Star Wars weapons and Daniel Graham, but you can copy it at the library. New York Times, March the 4th, 1985, has a full account of the background of the development of the Star Wars and how the Lawrence Livermore Lab was set up in 1950. That's just when the Cold War was really going to escalate and we were going to war in South Korea. And as soon as Ronald Reagan was governor of California, he went over to the laboratory, and already the nucleus for a first strike against the Soviet Union was being put into the hands of the scientists of America, and Ronald Reagan has been part of that from the very beginning. The account tells about the Hertz Foundation in 1940 that was set up, and Dr. Teller draws a lot of his help from there, and that he's on the board of the Hertz Foundation. This was started in 1940 at the time a lot of people wanted Adolf Hitler to win the war, and when J. Edgar Hoover was vice president of Interpol with Mr. Kaltenbrunner and Heydrich, these horrible Nazis, and our country was working very closely with Adolf Hitler until the time of Pearl Harbor, or actually until the invasion of Poland. On the board of the Hertz Foundation, along with Edward Teller, were such people as J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, General Curtis LeMay, head of the Strategic Air Command, and Herman Kahn of the Hudson Institute. This Star Wars thing has been cooking up for a long time. The Los Angeles Times has a large article, it was a Sunday editorial, February 17, 1985, by Thomas Power, also a well-known author. The layered truth behind the Star Wars. He says the purpose is not to keep the Soviets from threatening us. The real reasons for spending uncountable billions on space-based defense systems are buried so deep they are practically unconscious. And that is the thing I worry about in watching Reagan operate, or George Shultz, or Caspar Weinberger, or Mr. Eagleberger, or Mr. Byrd, and Henry Kissinger. It is in their unconscious, in their really black fascist power trip, that they will do anything. They will strike. They don't care what comes back on us. They don't care about what's polluted the billions of dollars it would take to clean up planet Earth right now. I truly believe that they don't care. There are very good writers exposing the insanity at a very intellectual level and a lot of statistics and the relationship of these people to what they have in mind, but nobody yet has really diagnosed them. I take it back. There's a psychiatrist in L.A. who has diagnosed Reagan as mentally sick. I'll tell you more about that next week or in a few weeks. I met with this doctor. He worked at Menninger's and at Mayo Clinic, and he was one of the few psychiatrists that ever saw Hess in the Spandau prison in Germany. And the reason I saw him is that he's trying to write a book on the fact that Ronald Reagan, as president, is mentally sick. And if I don't do it next week, I'll share it with you a little later, and I think he'd even let me use his name on the air. I went to see him and talked to him a few months ago, actually. Meanwhile, more about that later. This is Mae Brussell, and we are running out of time, so I'll have to cut it short now. The hour has gone by, and I'll be back with you next week.